Hello, and welcome to another edition of the 498 Show. I'm Tony Palmieri from the Communication Studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. I've been in this program now for over 35 years, and when people ask me to describe the history of it, I say, there's been two eras. There's the pre-JC era and the JC era. JC does not stand for Jesus Christ, but she's close, and her name is her name is Dr. Jennifer Considine. Jennifer, thank you so much for doing this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for the compliment.
Yeah, you really have been a transformative figure. You got here in 2008, and I describe it in my Rhetoric of Rock and Roll class. You're familiar with the band The Eagles,
Mhm.
and they were an excellent band from 1972 to 1976. But then in that year, a guy named Joe Walsh joined the band and took them to a whole new level. So you've kind of like been our Joe Walsh in the Department of Communications, if you don't mind that analogy. And one of the main reasons I have you here today is because you've recently published a textbook, Communication and Nonprofit Organizations, People and Practice. I've had a chance to look at the chapters. It's truly outstanding. And we'll talk about your book. But before we get to that, just tell us about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you go to school? How did you get to Oshkosh?
Sure. I grew up actually in Wisconsin. So I'm a local girl. I'm from Baraboo, Wisconsin, so not too far away from campus, and then had the opportunity to pursue a degree at Marquette University. Although I will say that I have a lot of sympathy for our transfer students because it took me 5 different schools to get my undergrad. But ultimately, I graduated from Marquette with a degree in communication. I worked in nonprofits for a couple of years in Madison. And then went on to get a master's degree at UW-Milwaukee and my PhD from Texas A&M University. So spent a couple of years teaching at the University of Montana before I came here to UW-Oshkosh.
Why the move from Montana to Oshkosh?
Oh, I tell my students that the short version of it is that I fell in love with my little brother's best friend. So that's the short version of how I got back to Wisconsin.
And that person you fell in love with is Carl Bulow, who is on the Oshkosh Common Council and is also employed by a nonprofit, right? He is, isn't he?
He is, in fact. He actually makes a cameo in chapter 4 in the book. So there's
That's
a
right.
practice, and it's Carl. But yeah, Carl has worked, I think, for 8 different nonprofit organizations now, from those that had a staff of 5 to those with a staff in the hundreds.
Wow. And the two of you have 3 children, and so you've kind of both been super parents since you've been here. I know that when you got here in 2008, your children were small. And so, those of us in academia know that being on the tenure track is quite demanding. So you did it while raising a family, which is incredible. Let's talk about your interest in nonprofits. You said that you had nonprofit experience in Madison. What type of nonprofit experience was that?
Yeah, so I was hired out of college for my first job was as a motivational workshop facilitator for a nonprofit organization. And this was at the very beginning of the W-2 program, which people are probably familiar with, but the Wisconsin Works program. So the idea of trying to transition folks off of welfare into the workplace. And so I was fresh out of college, 21 years old, and hired to facilitate motivational workshops for mostly women who were transitioning back into the workforce. So it was a great job, right? I felt like I was doing really meaningful work. I think the program was very well intended. After about a year, though, I became incredibly frustrated, partly with the premise of the program, right? The premise of the program was that people needed to be motivated, and that was the reason they weren't working. And I pretty quickly discovered that for most of these folks, the reason they weren't working is they didn't have, affordable childcare, right? And they didn't have affordable and stable housing. And it was all of these other things that they were having to navigate that was preventing them from finding a job, right? And even now we know today that most people who are working, right, who are trying to transition off of welfare are in like $11 or $12 an hour jobs, right? You can't afford self-sufficiency on that income. So
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
No, it always frustrated me. W-2,
Yeah.
Wisconsin Works, was always heralded as this great success. And yet I think people like you and others that were in the trenches with nonprofits, you knew what it was actually doing. And it sounds like the challenges were much greater than what some of our politicians were telling us. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think we were focused really, the program really focused us on short-term employment. It didn't focus us on long-term self-sufficiency and stable families. Right. And that's what really drew me, I think, to wanting to study and look at nonprofits at from a different lens, right? And think about how do we understand the system of how we produce nonprofits, how we're judging their effectiveness, what's working, and how do we make sure that people stay at the center of that. And I think that's my biggest drive, both with the book, right? And in the way I teach, you're saying like, this is about people, this is about relationships. And we can't forget that when we're organizing together.
Wow. Well, so now we know where you developed your interest now in nonprofits, but why now decide to write a book on it?
Yeah. So there's a couple of really great books out there by communication scholars, but they tend to focus on a piece of it, right? So Michael Kramer and Lori Lewis have really great books on volunteering, but it just focuses on the volunteering component of nonprofit. Matthew Koshman and Matthew Sanders have a really great book out there that takes a communication perspective of nonprofits and focuses on meaningful work and employees and the role of nonprofits in society. But as I was teaching my students, I learned a couple of things. One, they needed more than that, right? Most of my students were going into jobs where they were doing volunteer management and public relations and fundraising and advocacy. Like all of those things were part of their job. And so I wanted something that gave them a communication perspective on nonprofits, but that could also give us some practical knowledge about how to function in those internal and external communication roles that our students were having to do, right? So something that was both theoretical, but very practical.
Excellent.
My other goal, and you'll appreciate how difficult this is, was to try to maybe write something that they would read. So I'm still not convinced that I've done that. But every chapter starts with a case study in the hopes that it's like, okay, here's a real challenge. Can we then get to all the content and apply it?
Writing something that they will read, that is always the challenge, isn't it? And, we're going to get more into your book here in a second, but what you're doing with nonprofit, when I said earlier that you took this department to the next level, I think this has been a big part of it because from 1989 until 2008, those years before you got here, the pre-JC era, I never remember that many students saying, I want to go into nonprofits or that I see it as a viable career option for me. Almost immediately from the time you got here, students started immediately saying that nonprofits were a possibility for them. And I think in the last 10 to 15 years, we've had so many of our Com Studies alum, as you know, that are doing just amazing work in nonprofits. Besides teaching the class, what have you done with our students that gets them interested in that? Is it the manner in which you teach? Is it the content of your organizational comm classes?
Well, great question. I think one of the things that I'll admit that it's not me is that there's been a huge growth in the nonprofit sector, right? So all of a sudden there weren't that many jobs, and all of a sudden there's a ton of jobs, right? So that's part of it, right? And then I think the second thing is many of my students, when they come into my class, they have no idea what a nonprofit organization even is.
Right.
Like they've never considered that is a place to work. And if they do think about it, they assume always that they're going to make no money. Now, there is some reality to the fact that nonprofit salaries tend to be lower, right? We know that. We work in the public sector, right? But there also is the misunderstanding of the range of nonprofits, right? The Mayo Clinic is a nonprofit. It has 76,000 employees, but it's a nonprofit, right?
Right.
For a long time, the NFL was a nonprofit, right? Like, so there are a lot of nonprofit organizations. And so I think one of the things that we do in class is that we sort of blow apart people's ideas about what a nonprofit job looks like.
And so it becomes then a very realistic career option. And what I've been so inspired by is you find a way to tap into the idealism of young people, because I think that the overwhelming majority of young people really do want to make some positive difference in their communities, maybe in the nation, in the world at large. And I think that you really connect with that value system, which is really, I think, admirable. Let's talk about your book. It's got 11 chapters. And I guess the 11 chapters are divided into 3 sections, kind of like an intro to nonprofits, the people of nonprofits, and then how nonprofits communicate with their external audiences. So let's talk about each one of those sections. So what are some of the main points in your intro to nonprofit organizing?
So the first 3 chapters, chapter 1 focuses on what we just talked about, right? What is a nonprofit? We also talk about language in that chapter, right? Should we call them a nonprofit? What does that highlight, right? Simply the term nonprofit highlights the idea of money and that it's all about that, right? There are other terms that we could use, the third sector, the civil society sector, right? And so we wrestle with that and we think about the role of language in framing how we understand nonprofits, but also how we understand community issues and what problems are and what solutions might be. So we start from there and then we talk about chapter 2 used to be called Starting a Nonprofit. And then I was like, I can't cover that in 1 chapter. They need to go read another book for that. But we do get into some of the nonprofit foundations. So the idea that nonprofits are mission driven and that every decision should come back to the mission and how central that is, right? Mm-hmm. And how different that is from a for-profit, right? A for-profit exists to make money, right? It does. That is its fundamental goal. And a nonprofit exists for a different mission. So we talk about that. We talk about collaboration, which is fundamental to the nonprofit sector, whether it's a public-private collaboration, a collaboration with a corporation, community collaboration. So we talk about the communication challenges of that. And then there's a chapter on nonprofit governance. So the idea of serving on a board of directors, something most of our students have never thought about, even though a lot of boards want young people. And then I try to bring in some of the communication literature to offer some insight in some of the challenges of serving on a board. So things like, how do we make decisions? How do we handle conflict? What is everybody's conflict style? Those come from our small group communication literature, but I think can really offer some great insight for people who serve on nonprofit boards.
Wow. What more can you tell us about the people of nonprofit organizations? Is it like a special type of personality that gets into it?
You know, there is a lot to be said for meaningful work, right? And this idea of nonprofit work is a calling, and there is actually a lot of literature that talks about that. But it's more complicated than that. And even that phrase has some downsides to it, right? A lot of times when people are like, well, I'm doing this because it's my calling and it's meaningful. And then we have these stories of like these self-sacrificial, heroic nonprofit leaders, right? And then the students read those and like most of them are like, I'm out. I got other things to do. I need to, pay the bills. So I think it's a lot more than that when we talk about nonprofit employees. And so we talk about some of the challenges of working in a nonprofit. We also talk about the great things about it, right? Mm-hmm. And the meaningful work is great, but also, especially for our students, they often have a very small staff. And so you get to do a lot of things and try a lot of new things, which is a very cool thing to do if you're a nonprofit communication.
Yeah, I imagine that not all nonprofits are created equally, right? 100%. So some of them have a literal global reach.
Yep.
And some of them might be local to a community.
100%.
Does the public at large have reason to be a little bit more skeptical of those with the global reach? I mean, suppose I have $50 to donate to a nonprofit organization. Am I better off giving my $50 to a local nonprofit rather than one that has a more national or global reach, and why?
Great question. I don't know that I would simplify it quite that much, right? I think there are small local nonprofits doing really good work, and there are small local nonprofits who are investing a ton of money in overhead and not in their mission. And the same could be said for global multinational nonprofits, right? I think we have to think about when we're giving money, right? Like what is meaningful to us, but also how is the nonprofit connected in its local community? Just because a nonprofit exists in a local community doesn't mean it's connected. And just because a nonprofit is global, like some global nonprofits do a really great job of trying to connect in their local communities. Mm-hmm. Others are trying to bring solutions that make sense in one country and plop them into another country and in effect destroying a local economy.
Right.
Right. So we have to ask lots of critical questions. one of the things I always tell students in the class is you will not leave this class with all of the answers. If you think you will leave any class with all of the answers, you're being led astray, because we don't even know all the questions yet, right? But what I tell my students is I hope you leave my class with better questions, right? And that you can unpack a problem in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, that's so important to do. I imagine you do spend quite a bit of time when you're teaching nonprofit on really what is the third section of your book, the communication with external audiences. What is unique about the way that nonprofits communicate with external audiences?
So before I answer that question, I'm going to pop back to the last one and then I'll come back to that. Because
Sure.
we only talked about the people as employees. So there's only one chapter on employees. There's 2 chapters on volunteers. So volunteers are also a fundamental part of nonprofit organizations. And we think about how do we recruit and socialize and all of those things and retain volunteers. And then chapter 7 talks about co-contributors to nonprofit organizations. So this is the term that I actually learned from some of the global nonprofits. Trying to shift the language from clients of nonprofits, right, to co-contributors of nonprofits.
Oh, wow.
So all of the, all of the folks, for example, that I worked with in my first job, right, one of the mistakes I made is that I designed a motivational program without talking to anybody who was going to go through that program, right? Like now I look back on that and I'm like, the arrogance of that 21-year-old.
Right.
And that no nonprofit can succeed, right, without the people who are in theory served by that nonprofit. So I think we need to shift in our thinking of, and to think of folks as co-contributors, right? How are we creating together a nonprofit that's going to serve and solve our community problems? And that can't be done just by experts coming in from outside.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly. Thank you for that. So now let's get back to the external audiences. So what is unique about the way nonprofits communicate with externals?
So I think one of the differences is the public expectations, right? Nonprofits, it's marginal, but they still have a little bit more trust than other institutions do right now, right? Like nobody trusts any institution right now, but nonprofits have a little bit more public trust. And so their actions need to maintain that trust. But one of the things that's unique is sometimes what action maintains that trust can be really conflicting, right? So if you have a small nonprofit that has really flashy marketing materials, people might ask questions like, well, why are you spending all your money on marketing? Right? But if you're not spending money right now on having a social media presence and having somebody to run your website, right? People are also going to ask questions about that. Like, why is your website so terrible? Right? We have Canva. Can't you do better? Right? But funders don't want to pay for that. Right? Funders want to say, okay, like what direct service are you doing with the money I'm giving you? And that capacity building and marketing and those things are part of the direct service sometimes, right? But really educating funders about that can be very challenging.
Okay.
So I think that's what makes it unique.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. Are part of the external publics of nonprofits other nonprofits? And what I mean by that is, do you remember the Ice Bucket Challenge?
Yep.
All right. I thought it was a great cause and, millions of people got wrapped up in it. It raised a ton of money for, was that ALS? Right? But part of me thought, okay, they've developed this great technique of using the internet to get money. And I haven't seen any research studies on this, but didn't that have to hurt other nonprofits? Because I remember myself, as much as I think the ALS is an amazing, a really important cause, and I'd love to give to it, I remember thinking, if I give money for that, it's going to be less money for other things, right? So how do nonprofits conceive of other nonprofits? Do they see that they are responsible to them in any way?
Yeah, so I wouldn't globalize that, right? Like, I don't think we can say how nonprofits respond to other nonprofits. But I think what we can say is that the nonprofits have been set up in a system where they're fundamentally competing with each other. And that is not solving our social problems.
No.
Right? And so as we wrestle with how do we move away from that? How do we foster collaboration? Right? We have to really be aware of what's the collaborative process, right? And what's in it for everyone. And who's at the table and who's not at the table and who's winning and who's not winning. And that's probably more complicated than we ever even think it is, right? Like a lot of times we talk about like, okay, nonprofits need to serve community needs. I've been in a lot of community collaborations in this town where we talk about the people who maybe need housing and don't talk to the people that need housing.
Right.
But some of the reason that happens is because it's the nonprofit folks who are paid to sit in those collaborative rooms, right? And other people, right, are not paid to sit in those collaborative rooms. So I think the sector is really wrestling right now with how do we shift the funding to think about how do we collaborate more together, whether it's within the nonprofit sector or cross-sector partnerships, but in ways that are genuine. And that's where communication scholars can really help.
Yeah. Your book talks about the nonprofit sector as existing alongside the private sector, which I guess we would call for-profit business,
Yeah.
and the public sector, which would be government. Have the nonprofits become so much more important because of the breakdown of the public sector and the private sector? How do you explain that relationship of those three sectors?
Yeah, I think what you just said, right? We've had the breakdown in social services, right? And some of that was maybe well-intentioned at one point, right? There was the idea that small local nonprofits, or not even necessarily small ones, but the more localized nonprofits could respond to local community problems more creatively, more quickly, more effectively than, say, a government mandated solution, right? Like what needs to happen in Arizona is maybe different than what needs to happen in Idaho, right? And so the nonprofit sector, giving government funding to the nonprofit sector was supposed to enable more localized solutions, right? In theory, that's a great idea, right? But what has actually happened is those creative local solutions, there was also this idea that at some point we could scale them up. There aren't the resources to scale them up, right? And so then they're not getting the support. The public sector has this ability to scale up things, to access resources, right? I think another unintended consequence is nonprofits now have to prove themselves, right? Like, where's the data to show me that you solved the problem? And a lot of the problems that nonprofits are working on are not, this fix is not easily measurable. And it's not easy to be like, okay, this is the success that we had, right? If we go back to our early conversation about W-2, it's easy to measure how many people did we get into jobs. It's not easy to measure how many people 5 years out did we move into long-term self-sufficiency.
Right.
But that's probably what we really need to be measuring. And so I think the public, there's all of this tension, right, with that public-private partnership that is continuing to try to be navigated. And nonprofits are trying to step up, although we live in a time right now where a lot of the resources that nonprofits had are being tugged away from them very, very quickly.
Yeah, let's talk about that. We are doing this interview in June of 2025, and we know that the Trump administration has canceled, we're not even sure if this is legal yet, but they've canceled millions of dollars of grants that would be coming from Washington to a variety of nonprofits around the country. And this has impacted us even in Oshkosh, has it not?
Yeah, absolutely.
How so?
Yeah, so I mean, you have, for example, refugee service organizations, right, that were providing a lot of transition support, and they are now losing that federal funding, which loses staffing, so they're not able to do that. So then demand and pressure is put on other organizations that are trying to step up and fill that gap. Often those organizations are run entirely by volunteers, right? And they're trying to do that work with no compensation, right? Now, often those folks might be more connected to community, so they can provide those services, but it becomes a real challenge to do that. So yeah, there's this just dramatic sort of like pulling the rug out without thinking about where are the other fixes.
Right.
Right.
So, right. If the Trump administration is pulling the rug out from under nonprofits, are nonprofits now looking more toward the private sector? Are they looking for more contributions from corporations and other private entities?
Yeah, I think, well, one of the things to remark is that individuals still remain the largest single contributor to nonprofit organizations.
Okay.
Individual gifts are still the largest contributor. So individuals and where they put their money have a lot of power. There's no doubt about it. But there is trying to turn to private philanthropy, right? We have an Oshkosh Area Community Foundation that's trying to figure out like when and where do we need to step in here and how can we do that in a
Hmm.
manner that's really quick and that is going to serve the needs of the community. I think it's too soon to see a lot of those ripple effects and to see where organizations are going to turn because it doesn't feel like there are a lot of places right now.
Do nonprofit organizations consider the ethics of taking funding from certain private entities? I mean, suppose you have a private entity that's known for polluting the atmosphere and greenwashing their presence. Do nonprofits, do their boards get in a room and discuss, should we take money from this group, or is it like, hey, we need the funds, we don't care who it comes from?
I've had conversations with people who have answered that questions in exactly both of those ways,
Really?
right? Where some of them are saying, you know what, we're simply not going to accept a donation from that organization because it is so out of alignment with our values and our principles, right? And other organizations that have said, this is the way the model is set up right now. So if we don't take this grant, then 100 people aren't going to eat. So, well, that feels like a terrible trade-off and I don't want to do it. I also want to feed those 100 people, right? And so there is, I think, that dilemma that is, you constantly have to wrestle with that dilemma.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Is your book primarily for students, or did you also write this for the people in nonprofits that they could benefit from it?
I would hope it's for both. So certainly it's primarily written for students. It's set up as a textbook, right? There are discussion questions at the end. There's key terms. There's a glossary. There's case studies. It's set up as a textbook. Um, but I will say that I had some folks who work in nonprofits be my pre-readers. And I
Oh,
would hand
wow.
over a chapter and be like, hey, does this help? Does this make any sense? So my mom, for example, serves on the board of directors of a small community medical free clinic, right? And my class actually a couple of years ago worked with the board of directors and interviewed every member of the board and then put together some recommendations. And so I had her read the chapter and she was like, okay, this is really helpful. This gives me a different way to think about issue X or issue Y. When my partner Carl got a new job in, just recently got a new job in fundraising, I was like, you need to read chapter 10. And he did. And he was like, oh, this is so helpful. And then I was like, okay, and then here's 7 other books that I referenced in chapter 10. Now go read those. And his response was, can you give me some podcasts? And I was like, okay, we can do that too.
Right.
Right. But yeah, I think it for people who are brand new into the nonprofit sector, or even people who have been there for a while, I think there's a lot of language that comes out of communication that might allow people to frame an issue in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think your chapter, I think it's your last chapter on advocacy.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that would be incredibly valuable for all nonprofits out there. Because I would imagine that one of the major challenges that nonprofits have, in addition to the funding challenges, is just being very persuasive advocates for whatever their mission is, right? What are some of their challenges in advocacy?
Yeah, so we just talked about government funding, right? And this public-private relationship. And so if you're a nonprofit that gets a lot of government funding, it can be really scary to then push back in advocacy about a public policy that doesn't serve the people that you're trying to serve, right? So you're caught in that tension of, should I kind of work with legislators here and try to be very advocacy oriented, or is it time to be more of an activist and be more adversarial? And they have to make those choices. I will say that there's so much evidence out there, though, that advocacy works,
Oh,
right? Just recently, for example, the National Council of Nonprofits, I was on their webpage today, and there was a provision, I don't know if you saw, but there was a provision in this big bill that's going through that would have given the executive branch basically the opportunity to strip nonprofit status from anyone. And so the nonprofits came together, did a ton of advocacy work, and at least as of this morning, that provision has been removed from the bill,
oh,
right? And is no longer there. So I think advocacy can work at that level. Advocacy can also work at a very local level. We've seen, for example, in our state, some of the nonprofits, one that comes to mind is Wisdom, that does a lot of work around criminal justice reform and did a ton of advocacy to increase funding for treatment alternatives and diversions, right? And that happened. And there's a ton of work that they continue to do that's changing legislation around criminal justice reform.
excellent. I love what you said about advocacy working. And for our students in the comm studies program, that I think is such a empowering lesson that they get. I mean, as you know, we use the phrase find your voice. And I think that our students find that speaking out in a clear, articulate, persuasive manner on something does have impact.
Mhm.
All right. People in power will listen. You may not get your desired result immediately, but you're leading a path to finally getting something done. You know, and speaking of UW Oshkosh, as you know, our campus is going through some, pretty major structural changes right now. You obviously are a scholar in organizational communication. How can organizational communication inform what we're going through right now on our campus?
Yeah, so organizational communication really centers people and processes, right? And I think we have to think about when big decisions are made, who's in the room, even more importantly, maybe who's not in the room, right? And what might we be missing when certain people are not in the room to make decisions? So I think that's always really useful. I think as we've done some of our restructuring over the past year, right, there has been an effort to try to figure out who do we need to get in the room, right? And how do we have these conversations? So I think that's something that we can look at, right? I think it comes back to questions of collaboration more than ever, right? As we're going through these changes in our institution, how do we collaborate both across sort of internal departments, but how do we collaborate externally, right? And we need to put in place incentives for collaboration. In most places, we don't have incentives to collaborate. And I think we need to think about that. The last thing I will say is I love some of Lori Lewis's work on communicating change.
Mm,
And one of the things that she talks about is we have to acknowledge the emotion, right? That change in and of itself, but particularly change, like you've been here, I've been here 17 years, you've been here 35 years, right?
mhm.
Change can be really good, but change is also, it's hard, it's emotional. With there any change, even if there are positive things, there are also losses to it. And that needs to be acknowledged.
Are you overall optimistic about where the universities of Wisconsin system is headed?
I am optimistic because of the people that I interact with.
Yeah.
Right? I am optimistic. I mean, that's one of the things that I've always said about this place, right? Like, even when you say, like, I'm getting our students to tap into their inner idealist and like go work in nonprofits. Well, only because you were like, okay, y'all need to acknowledge the problems that are happening in the world right now. Right. And so I think we have the privilege of working with really awesome people here in this department. And we have the privilege of working with students who want the world to be better and who are
Yeah.
pretty frustrated with what they're inheriting and sometimes want to, like we all do, want to escape it, right? Want to be like, I'm just going to check out into social media right now. And I think one of our jobs is to say, no, this physical reality exists. These are the people we live with. We got to figure out how to work together to do that. But I see so many of our students who want to do that, right?
Oh, I do
They
too.
want to connect. They want to put people first. They want to make the world better. And
I agree. I
I'm
agree
optimistic for
100%.
those reasons.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the Gen Z, the people born between 1997 and 2012, I mean, I think they get such a bad rap
Mhm.
because I have seen so many students that, as you say, really want to see change. And I think they really want to be part of the solution. And actually, in this last part of this interview, Jennifer, you strike me as someone that's always, you kind of like model being part of the solution. How did you develop that ethic? I mean, is this something that came from your family background? Is it something you got in school? All of the above? How did you get that way?
I mean, I think to a degree, all of the above, but I would really credit it to my parents, right?
Wow.
And my parents and my family, I grew up on a goat farm actually. So I grew up like 200 goats, and I can remember times were hard a lot of times when we were growing up, right? Like we had an old farmhouse that literally we fell through the floor at one point, right? And that was normal. That was just life. And then you went to the barn and you milked the goats. Right. So I think I learned from my parents to work really hard. But I also learned from my parents that like you can make a difference, right? Your actions make a difference. So my dad was a middle school teacher for 32 years,
Hmm.
and then retired from middle school to run for state legislature and served in the state legislature for 10 years. right? And really, and now he's tried to retire and he fails. And he's the town board chair of his local town because there were needs that somebody needed to step up, right? And my mom has also failed retirement like 3 times now. And his right now is the medical director of a free clinic, right? And so she retired from her career as a PA and is the medical director and is working really hard to make sure this clinic stays open and providing care to folks who are, many of whom are undocumented and have no other healthcare available to them. Right. So I see them doing that and also raising 5 kids and welcoming the community to their farm and all of those things. And I think like, okay, if they can do that, like that gives me hope.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely amazing. And what about your teaching philosophy? One thing that I have been in awe of in watching you over the years is your level of compassion, your level of care, your level of flexibility. I've always watched you in interaction with students where things that tend to get me upset, like for example, when a student asks me a question about something that's clearly in the syllabus, I always want to lash out and say, it's in the syllabus, read it. But not you. You actually keep the conversation going. This too, none of us as college teachers, I don't know about you. I mean, no one really ever taught me how to teach, right? As college teachers, we kind of get in there and we learn it somehow. What developed your compassion, your care, your flexibility?
The thing that is popping into my head is a moment during graduate school with Kathy Miller, who is an amazing human and was my advisor at the time. And I remember going into Kathy's office and I was super stressed out. I was near tears. I was just overwhelmed by all of the things that I was doing. And Kathy said, I won't accept your paper for 3 weeks. And I was like, but it's due next week. And she was like, yeah, but not for you. I don't want it for at least 3 weeks. You can't work on it for the next week. And I was like, what? You can do that? You can just change the rules and tell me that I shouldn't be this stressed out? And she was like, yeah, like, what's it going to hurt? I'll grade it in 3 weeks. And that was such a monumental moment for me because I didn't even know how on the edge I was until Kathy saw it, right? And I think about that with our students. Like we don't know any of their full stories, right? And I never want to be the moment that's going to push the student over the edge, right? Like it doesn't hurt me to answer the question. And so I think I really want our students to feel like this is a place where they can come and be a heart of community because not everybody has that everywhere. I was so lucky to have that from my family. And I want our students to have that too.
Yeah, and you've just been so remarkably successful at that. I'm fortunate to work with a lot of our alumni because of classes that I've taught, like Career Capstone and Capstone and Comm Studies. And almost all of them, when I say who have been your most influential teachers, Jennifer Considine comes up at the top of the list almost every time. So you're doing something right, Jen, and it's much, much appreciated. And once again, the book is Communication and Nonprofit Organizations. It is an academic book, but people could find this on Amazon.com, I imagine, right?
Yep, they can find it on Amazon or go directly to the publisher's website. So the publisher is Cognella.
The publisher is Cognella. You can find it there also. Jennifer, thank you for doing this, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Tony.
All right.